Cool. It looks like we're live. So yeah, welcome everyone to Quinn's first online webinar. I'm Barry Rogers, the head of product at Quinn. Hopefully some of you have been using our diabetes self-management app for a little while now, and so know a little about Quinn's mission to give power and choice to people living with diabetes. And this is the first in a series of discussions that Quinn will be hosting on important subjects for people living with diabetes. So from food and nutrition, through diabetes decision-making, to mental health and how to improve well-being and choice. So we hope you find them informative and interesting, and supportive and motivational, and most of all novel, as we don't plan to shy away from difficult topics. And we're very excited to get all of you watching involved too and hear your thoughts. So today our topic is understanding food myths in type 1 diabetes. We're going to dive into discussions around nutrition, diets and food myths. And with us this evening, we have two wonderful, knowledgeable and experienced guests to share their thoughts and expertise with us. So beside me is Beth Edwards, who is a registered nutritional therapist whose approach combines evidence-based advice with person-centered care. She has a nutritional therapist diploma, and her training in health psychology allows her to blend the emotional and physical in her clinic. She's also been living with type 1 diabetes for 23 years. So welcome, Beth.
Thanks, Barry.
And we also, below me, I have Dr. Cathy Richards, who is a clinical specialist in diabetes and obesity. She holds a PhD in nutrition and a BSc in human nutrition and dietetics, and has worked as a CORU registered dietitian, specializing in diabetes since 2003. She's also been a DEFNI educator for 15 years. So welcome, Cathy.
Thanks, Barry. Hi, everyone.
Cool. So it's fair to say I'm by far the least qualified in this conversation. So I'm going to stick mainly to asking the questions. But this webinar is an interactive webinar, so we're excited to have everyone watching join in the fun. Hopefully you should all be able to see that we have an area for chat, questions and polls. So throughout the session, if you have any questions you would like Beth or Cathy to answer, submit them and upvote other people's questions you would most like answered. We'll have about 10 minutes or so at the end for Q&A, and we'll try to get through as many questions as we can. We'll also be holding some polls to get your opinions on a few subjects, and there's a special bonus for those of you who participate in the polls and are still watching at the end of the webinar. We will be having a prize draw. So Beth has very kindly offered one lucky viewer 25% off her 3-month reset and rebalance program. And that's a great prize for our first webinar. So thank you, Beth.
Very welcome.
And so finally, a chat is available for you to share your thoughts, react and engage with us and each other. Some of you have clearly already found that. So let's see some more hellos in the chat as well. Let's get this started. Food is obviously a very personal subject, and remember, it's okay for people to have different opinions. So let's try and keep the chat positive and supportive and avoid trolling, unless it's about my lockdown haircut, I guess, because that's fair game for some comedy comments. It's been 4 months without a haircut, so it's fine. Anyway, let's get started. So Beth and Cathy, are you ready to go?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Cool. And chat, are you ready for us to get started too? Awesome. So great. Let's dive in straight with a big question to start. So Cathy, when someone with diabetes comes to you for advice, what are the first things you like to find out about their diet and attitude to food?
Okay. So I was thinking about this question, Barry, when you kind of flagged it to me last week, and I think probably one of the first things I'd like to find out about, I suppose I might think about it a little bit differently if somebody is newly diagnosed with type 1 diabetes compared to maybe somebody who has diabetes for longer. If somebody is newly diagnosed, I think the first thing I always like to ask about is how food fitted into their typical day or their life, or how they like to eat before diagnosis. Because I think sometimes, well, that can uncover that there's unnecessary restriction. I'm sure we'll talk about it later, but there's lots of food police when you're diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And often people have just been told, or you can't eat this, or you can't eat that. So there's a lot of restriction. So I'd always ask people about how they ate before relative to now, and are there things that they missed or that they've changed, or that they're finding difficult or don't like. And often during that conversation, I suppose we can establish that they mightn't need to be doing what they're doing if they're finding it difficult. They may be able to eat the way they ate before. And then I think if somebody is diagnosed a while and it's my first time meeting them, I'd always like to just, I suppose, ask about I'd always start with what the person already knows. So I suppose asking, what are your thoughts on nutrition and food and where it fits in with your diabetes, and then kind of take the conversation on from there, filling in gaps if necessary in knowledge, or supporting the person where they need support. That'd be kind of where it starts.
Yeah, I'd say that sounds great. It makes total sense to have the two different approaches. And so, Beth, is that similar to how you approach people?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it really, really is. And I think what Cathy mentions about the restriction is really, really important. I think what I try to understand when I work with people with type 1 is perhaps what I do see quite often is subconsciously people tend to restrict and limit certain types of food, maybe unconsciously. And that kind of makes perfect sense, because we know with type 1, it's a creature of habit. It just absolutely loves routine. So if you work out, say, a breakfast that just works perfectly for your blood sugars, and you understand your insulin to carb ratio and you nail it, you're more likely to eat that again and again and again. And actually what can then happen is that we narrow when we sort of get the blinkers on. And really, I'm all about food freedom. I think we can have whatever we like. There's lots of space for all foods in a type 1 healthy diet. So I think the restrictive sort of side of it is quite important. But I'm also quite keen to understand if somebody is currently following or has previously followed a particular type of approach to eating with type 1. So I think people listening to this will be quite familiar with different types of dietary approaches, and there are quite a few out there. But I suppose the main ones are sort of low carb, high fat, and then the reverse of that, the sort of plant-based, high carb, low fat. So I'm quite keen to understand if someone has gone down that route, and possibly why, and what that sort of looks like for them. So just trying to understand where food is placed in the context of their type 1, and trying to kind of think about how someone with type 1 views food with that lens. So yeah, just trying to understand that kind of identity with food, I think, is really important.
Cool. Yeah. So there's two fantastic responses to start with. So thank you both already. And so I guess on to the next question then, Beth, as well, is so with the imprecision for the nutrition of food, and you've got the 42 or more factors which affect blood sugar, as well as all the unknown unknowns. What are your thoughts on handling the uncertainty of diabetes when it comes to deciding what to eat and dose?
This is a great question, because I think it's so difficult. And I think I just want to kind of underline that and say that I wish there was a perfect answer, or there was a perfect way that we could eat with type 1 and not have fluctuations that we don't want. But I think, particularly if we're eating out, I know at the moment we're not able to do that, but I know that eating out can be quite difficult for people because it's so spontaneous quite often, and you're not really sure what's coming on a menu. So I would just say, wherever possible, just really think about the self-compassion, and really think about the fact that probably 80% of the time you can control what you're eating, and you can sort of know your carbs inside out. But for that 20%, there's a bit of leeway. And actually, if things do fluctuate because you've had a nice meal out, I would just really try and encourage people to think that this is so much more than the numbers. This is about the contextual sort of environment, and food is not just food. I think when we live with type 1, we get quite numbers based because we have to be, but food is about enjoyment and coming together. It could be just a pizza on the sofa in lockdown because that's all you can do, whatever it is. So I think where you can, I think if it's possible to track and understand how food works for you in terms of your insulin to carb ratios and what works, log where you can, understand your patterns to build up confidence. I encourage that in my clients, but at the same time, I try not to get people to worry a little bit too much unnecessarily about the uncertainty, because there are going to be ups and downs with type 1, and I think we have to accept that. And once we accept that, I think we can move beyond the shame that often I sort of see in clinic. Yeah.
Cool. And so, Cathy, as a Daphne educator, I've personally obviously never been on a Daphne course, but is this similar to how you sort of explain food to, especially people who are new to diabetes? We have some classic internet connection challenges here. I assume. Oh, can you hear us again, Cathy? Oh, no. Okay, so I guess we'll get Cathy back later. This is the challenge you obviously have when we're working online. Cathy is also based in Ireland, so maybe they've got a bit more snow than we have here in London. So I'm going to jump on to the next question then and have a quick chat with Beth. So you've mentioned already around how people view their blood sugar after eating different foods and that element of it. And so do you have any support tips and techniques on how to reduce self-judgment when blood sugar doesn't react how you expect?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, yeah, I've lived with type 1 for almost a quarter of a century. So that's sort of like simultaneously bizarre, but also it's so ingrained in my life. But I know firsthand that if I get up and I look at my CGM and it's a number that I don't really like the look of, that can then affect the rest of my day. And I think we have to work quite hard as type 1 to sort of separate ourselves from our blood sugars. So quite often a lot of my work is around kind of getting people to really journal things out and think through the fact that blood sugars, like your self-worth is not linked to your blood sugar. Like your identity as a person is separate to your type 1. So there's a lot of kind of mindset work that I would do with people to kind of reframe how they view their numbers and how they think of their numbers, because I think we can get caught up in good v bad. It's quite binary, like it's either high or it's low, it's in range or it's out of range. And it's about really trying to think, well, this is an information tool. Like whatever your blood sugar is telling you, that's an information tool. So I try and help people reframe how they can use that. And you can use that information to then act. It doesn't reflect whether you're a good or bad person. And I think I work quite hard with people on that because it can creep in quite insidiously in the background. So yeah, really trying to reframe the numbers, I think, is the best thing that I can suggest there in terms of using it as information, not as a reflection of identity.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds great. I would have gone to Cathy, but unfortunately she appears to have lost her internet connection again. So hopefully we'll be able to get her back again shortly. So maybe let's go to our first user poll. So I'm going to publish a poll right now, and hopefully everyone watching can go and see that. And so this may or may not be widely known, but regulations allow for nutrition values on food packaging to be up to 20% different from what they show. And so that includes carbohydrates, sugars, proteins, fats, calories, and vitamins. And there have also been some investigations looking at how consistently manufacturers and restaurants actually stick within these guidelines. So we have a poll there just to see whether this is information that's new to you or not. Again, this could be incredibly important. We appear to have Cathy back again.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm back.
Wonderful. So yeah, Cathy, given all the ambiguity around nutritional numbers, do you have any advice on how to deal with estimating and understanding how carbs might affect blood sugar?
Yeah, I suppose, sorry that I missed the last question as well. I suppose coming back to the idea of uncertainty and how we manage that. I think one of the things I always say to people is we talk about thinking like a pancreas, but you have to accept you're not a human pancreas and you're being asked to do this really complex task with the information you have available to you. So there are resources definitely that we would encourage people to use. This was learning carb count, so things like carbs and calories, or weighing food. Sometimes we can talk about that in terms of mental health maybe in a minute. The other interesting thing I think I've learned from Daphne courses is that people seem to have very different ways of figuring out how to use a food label. So one of the things I've learned is it's actually really unhelpful to try and teach somebody how to do that in your way. We all seem to deal with numeracy, I suppose, differently. So I'll always say to people, it's worth sitting down with some food labels yourself and trying to figure out how do I work this out. So if I'm here on the go trying to figure this out, what's the best way for me? You know, some people will divide it into portions and some people will divide by 100 and some people get out a calculator. And I think it's worth tuning into how your brain does that. And then I suppose the other thing around the uncertainty with and the amount of carbohydrate that may be in foods relative to the label is, I think it's important to develop a good relationship with your corrections. So I kind of accepting that it's just not possible to hit that number all the time for a myriad of reasons. And and yeah, I suppose you'll hear rage bolusing sometimes, just that extreme frustration when you feel I've nailed all the calculations and the numbers should be there and it's not, and sometimes you can't get to the bottom of why that is. So I suppose it's having a good relationship with your corrections as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so Beth, as well, like, do you advise people to gain a deeper understanding of the food they're eating? For example, looking at other macronutrients like protein and fat, or at something maybe like the glycemic index to see how these may affect blood sugar over time as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just tell you a little story, a little anecdote, if I may. So I was diagnosed when I was 9, which is back in the 90s. And when we were first sort of given education, there was a real sort of push around amount of sugar per 100 grams. So I think that was kind of how we started off. And I think that was very much the sort of tone of the time. And now I think we understand a bit more about how actually all foods can impact blood sugars. So not just sort of sugar and carbohydrate, but also how fat can sort of be it can slow down absorption of carbohydrates, but also protein. And also things like fiber. Fiber is kind of not as sexy as it should be, because I think it's just absolutely incredible in terms of just helping slow down the sort of breakdown of the carbs into the sugar. So you don't get that massive spike, but you can have a more gradual increase. And glycemic index and glycemic load I think is really important as well, because it's just about education around different types of carbohydrates and how they might impact blood sugars. So often, you'll find people like me and Cathy probably saying, let's think about carbs. But actually, when we think about a plate of food, again, it's not sort of single nutrients or single macronutrients. We're thinking about a plate of food and what does that look like? And also what's realistic, what's someone actually eating? So we could give them a sort of list of low GL, like glycemic load foods, but if that doesn't really suit their palate, then we're not doing anyone a service there. So yeah, I think it's having that broad sense of different types of food and how that can impact the body and different hormones, particularly cortisol and insulin. But at the same time, what's the individual doing and how does it look for them? How does it apply to them?
Cool. That's a great answer. Again, it takes us wonderfully onto our next user poll as well. So we're going to catch up at the end and go through all the polls to look at sort of your feedback and your questions. So this one is going to look more at your approach to experimenting with different or complex foods as well. So we would love to know, like, would you like support on experimenting with different or more complex foods? And so I think I'm going to go back to you again quickly, Beth. So a big part of your services involves bespoke packages for those who come to you. How do you work with people to find out what works for them personally?
Well, it's very collaborative, so it's quite a sort of like back and forth process. So we'll sort of make gradual changes and see how they land, and then we do it as a team. And if things need to be shifted, we will shift them. And I think what I sort of want to say at this point as well is that I think quite often, with my patient hat on, as someone with type 1, I often think the healthcare professional knows best. And there's this kind of didactic relationship where I'm going to the healthcare professional for advice and they're all knowing and they can tell me and I can do it and it's going to be magic. And actually, I think what I really want to kind of impress, just from my experience clinically, is that the patient knows best. The patient knows their body best. And I think it's about sort of that empowerment, and type 1 is such a self-managed condition. You'll have your kind of contact points, but then outside of that, it's down to you. And I think it's, understanding the person knows what they're doing. So yeah, working personally with someone, it's just trying to make sure that what I'm giving them is sort of appropriate for them and it's doable. It's not too much to sort of change, because again, living with type 1 is like an extra job that you didn't sign up for and you can't leave. So I don't want to give you an extra job on top of that of trying to kind of work out nutrition and food and make it complicated. So quite often we'll start simple and build up, and if things don't work, then we do shift it. And yes, my approach really is trying to be as kind of inclusive as possible in terms of food and nutrition, and trying to help people kind of find their balance, not just with their numbers, but also their emotions around their type 1 and their food. Yes, I could go on longer, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, because again, we know that everyone living with type 1 diabetes is different, and so they will react differently as well. And so, Cathy, do you see a journey that people with diabetes go on in their relationship with food and diets? And if so, what sort of stages do you see?
Yeah, so I suppose I mentioned this at the beginning. Very typically, I think when people are diagnosed at first, there is a drive maybe to restrict, and they're being told, oh, you can't eat this and you can't eat that. And it's a lot of negative messaging around food. And then I suppose as people move along their journey of living with diabetes, they'll often start to realize this isn't a sustainable way of living by restricting food all of the time. So then I suppose it's trying to find some kind of equilibrium or balance for themselves. So what's going to work? Where does food fit in? Beth mentioned for some people, following a really specific approach is really helpful and it gives a structure. And for other people, that's unhelpful for mental health. It's too much. It's another huge task to have to do every day. So for me, I suppose when I'm supporting people on that journey, the key word for me is flexibility. It's recognizing that your relationship with food and your diabetes will, I suppose, ebb and flow, and there'll be differences, and not getting locked into a very black and white way of saying, this is how I manage this. So try and keep that open. I think as well, the relationship that we try to establish with people as the healthcare professional, that needs to be a very non-judgmental relationship. Like, food is so stigmatized. It can be very difficult for people to have open conversations about how they're actually eating sometimes, because there's a fear that we'll be judged. So I think from my point of view, that's key. It's saying, the floor is open. There won't be judgment here about what you're doing. This is about figuring out how to keep your diabetes in a safe place, or that you feel you're managing well.
Yeah, totally. And we've interviewed a lot of people with diabetes, obviously, for designing our app, and also we do lots of research. And one of the other things that comes out to us as well is that this is cyclical as well, depending on what's going on in your life. If you've had a bad time, some people do go back to that restriction for a little while because they find that works, until they can feel free to experiment a bit more again. So it's really interesting to see the relationship with food shift and change, as you're saying, Cathy, ebbs and flows. And so, Beth, with that as well, I guess there's lots of different diets available, especially now on the internet. So how do you communicate the benefits of those different diets alongside possible short and maybe longer term risks associated with them? For example, maybe like long-term implications of low carb or keto diets.
Yeah, well, I think I just wanted to sort of echo what Cathy said there, that I really fully support that journey that she mentioned. And I think just that sort of that tricky situation with food, where it is such a kind of hot potato, and that is a pun, I will use that pun, but it is just, it's so ingrained in type 1, but it's also so complicated. So I think that non-judgment is really important when sort of communicating sort of pros and cons of different types of diets. And I think I try and be as clear as I can around the facts and what the evidence says. So I think that's sort of fair enough to really kind of explain what we know, but also what we don't know, because a lot of these diets, we just don't really have enough long-term evidence to sort of say yay or nay for sort of a long-term situation. But that being said, if it works for the bio individual and it's going good and it's going well for them, then I'm not going to stop anyone doing that. It's just about sort of coming at it from a very non-judgmental standpoint, sort of explain what could be going on, why you sort of may sort of do low carb for a while and you feel really good, but then you may hit a wall. Just trying to understand some of the science behind why that might be. Lots of people I work with will have done a low carb diet and they'll say, well, I lost loads of weight to begin with and I was really pleased. And again, I might just sort of mention that that's really good if that's what they wanted to do, but quite often that can just be tied to water loss. It's not necessarily a true sort of mass loss. So that's why they might find that later down the line, the weight comes back on, and that can sort of just be helpful in terms of explaining the science. So I think if the person's up for it, we can go quite in depth into the biochemistry to understand why certain things might happen, and also as a result, sort of pros and cons in the long term.
Yeah, it sounds great. There's a lot of education involved as well there, because if ultimately the person living with diabetes is making the choice, the more information that they have available gives them that understanding of the risks they're taking for themselves, as well as potential outcomes and shifts in sort of lifestyle that will accompany with it. And they can make like an informed decision, at least around that. So
Yeah.
thank you all. We've only got a couple of questions at the moment from our viewers. So again, if you have a quick think about some questions that you might like to answer at the end, chuck them down and we'll go through them at the end. But I think it's time for our third and final poll right now. So this is more around where you go to get some of your information and tips around diabetes. And again, Beth, I'm going to start with you. So as someone who both lives with diabetes and advises others, how do you feel about the general and seemingly constant noise around different foods and diets?
Well, I think someone said ebb and flow earlier on. I think it was you, Barry. And I think that's probably sometimes how I feel. Like I've got a hungry belly. I'm a foodie. It's a bit of a cringy phrase, but anyway, love food. But despite all of that, sometimes I just find it a bit overwhelming, and I appreciate that I work in this field. And if I'm finding it overwhelming, then I'm sure other people with type 1 are also finding it quite noisy. And I think sometimes in the nutrition world, there can be, someone follows a certain diet and it goes really well, and then that becomes a sort of diet of the moment. And I think we can sort of get carried away a little bit with that sometimes. And yeah, I think I don't mind however anybody wants to eat if that works for them. But I think the food police that Cathy mentioned can sometimes be problematic in terms of there can be some quite strong opinions on how you should and shouldn't eat. But because we're all so individual and so unique, it might just not apply. And I say sort of unique, but it's not just the sort of biological, but it's also the emotional and psychological too. So it is noisy out there, but yeah, I think there are good places to find information, and I think as well taking things with a pinch of salt can be quite helpful in terms of what you're reading. But lots of people with type 1 do lots of reading around this area and are very well informed too. I think it's just sort of balancing that out with how much information you can handle, whether it's coming like from Instagram or YouTube, or you're reading science journals, whatever it is. It's about pacing yourself, I think. It can be quite tiring.
Cool. And Cathy, if you can still hear us, I see that you post about this on Twitter and you're very passionate about this as well. Is there anything you would like to add on the same subject?
Sorry, Barry, I lost you there. Can you just go to the beginning of the question again?
Yeah, so I was just saying I've seen that you've also posted on a similar vein on Twitter, and you're very passionate about the same subject. So I was just wondering if you had anything to add to what Beth was saying.
Yeah, I suppose it's exhausting. And I think this time of the year is particularly noisy around food. The whole January new start dieting, it's particularly challenging, I think, for people. Yeah, I mean, I think I would just agree with Beth. There's a lot of, it's very polarized discussion, I think, always around good and bad foods. Or I think for me, one of the things that is very difficult is I think sometimes it pathologizes very normal eating behavior. So I think that's often a helpful discussion to have with people. So it's normal to get hungry, and that's not a bad thing. And like if we haven't eaten in 6 hours, that there are norms, there are biological norms that have nothing to do with choice or the kind of blame and shame side of this. And I think sometimes that's helpful to explore people, because you don't ever hear about that in the media. It's always the opposite. It's about restriction and less and that side of things.
Yeah, and totally. And also, Cathy, how do you handle when someone raises like a misconception relating to food or diet that maybe has been disproven already?
Yeah, I think it's tricky in the world of nutrition, because you can effectively prove anything. So I think it's unhelpful probably to get into an argument with anybody, because it is rarely black and white. So I suppose I'd always try to get a good understanding of where the person is coming from, why this topic is really important to them. Then I suppose if the information is, if there's contrary information, I try and present that in a neutral way and say, well, there is another school of thought or another set of evidence that says this. What do you make of that? And I suppose try and weigh that up. And at the end of the day, I suppose, regardless of what the science says, it's really about what's going to work for that person or apply in that person's situation. So sometimes if you've had a neutral conversation about the pros and cons of a particular approach or particular way of eating, where you really want to move to is the pros and cons for that person, not the necessarily just the science bit. It's practically how would that work or how would that fit in.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I guess the same question to you as well, Beth, where you are working with people over a number of months. It'd be interesting to hear how you engage with them on the personal level, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think what's really important to bear in mind is that quite often, well, almost always, people are coming to me with sort of suggestions of ways to eat. And again, it's because they're so desperate to manage their type 1. So it's all coming from a good place. It's kind of this desperate seeking of sort of what the truth is and what the answer is for them. So I think even if it might be something I may not necessarily kind of put my seal of approval on, I'm really keen to make sure that I can hold space for that person in terms of why this is such a hugely important thing for them. I think, again, neutrality is so important to be able to kind of present back a little bit as to why there's a different point of view and why that might sort of contradict possibly. But I have to say, probably from my experience, quite often how this kind of question presents in my clinical experience is someone will come and say, oh, I've been told I can't eat X, Y, Z. Is that true? So it's more someone is just asking me like to sort of disprove it for them anyway. They want that kind of sort of reassurance because maybe they've read something about fruit or something like that. So quite often I don't find it a sort of challenging conversation in terms of a combative one. It's more just that I think someone is seeking some reassurance to be able to eat. And yeah, I'm more than happy to do that. But I think it just is testament to how much people pick up on the way, the sort of food beliefs that you might pick up. And also on that note as well, I think because type 1 is with you forever, it's not going anywhere. It does ebb and flow in terms of your food and your relationship. And I think from my own perspective, I've tried quite a few different types of diets. I think lots of people with type 1 want to just give things a go, and again, to try and better their health and make sure they're looking after themselves. But it can be tricky when you sort of do one diet and then you change it and everyone's like, oh, I thought you couldn't have that. And you're like, oh, actually, I've slightly shifted my mind. I hope you don't implicitly judge me for doing that. So I think there's also that sort of context there that we have to appreciate, that people can change tack and it can be quite difficult. Well, I found it difficult to have to sort of get back off my high horse and say maybe that wasn't quite the right thing for me.
It's just wonderful to hear sort of the personal and personalized and also the caring approach that you both have to the people you are looking after and sort of trying to help. So it's been wonderful hearing your responses. And so I think it's probably time to go on to some Q&A from the viewer questions. So we're going to start with one that is obviously such a big one in the diabetes community. And so what are some tips for eating pizza? And why is pizza so impossible to dose for? So as you mentioned pizza earlier, I'm going to go to you, Beth, first of all.
I think pizza is one of the foods that comes up without doubt at pretty much every encounter I have with a client. Is usually pizza will come up once at least throughout the whole duration. The reason it's so hard is because you're getting quite a large amount of carbohydrate and a large amount of fat together. So the challenge can be just the absorption of the carbohydrate. So what people tend to find happening, and this isn't sort of true in every case, but what typically will happen is that you will have the pizza, put in, quite a lot of insulin rather for the carbohydrate, but then people may dip a little bit low because the fat has slowed down the absorption of carb. And then if you're having pizza in the evening, people then tend to go quite high overnight when they can't necessarily manage the blood sugars as well. So it depends on the kind of regime that the person is using, if they're on multiple dose injections versus pumps. But if you're on MDI, what I would tend to suggest with people is splitting your dose of insulin. So you give a little bit up front, but not much, probably sort of 50% or less actually of your total carb amount. And then I would probably suggest three hours later, maybe, if you're still awake at that point, to have the rest. And then if you're on a pump, you can do a sort of a dual wave bolus or something else. You can drip it in across hours, which is really helpful. But I think despite all of that, from my own experiences and my clients' experiences, it doesn't always play ball. So I think, again, pizza is one of those foods that can be challenging. And I think we can have to accept that, really, in terms of it may cause us some difficulty, but that doesn't mean we haven't got to eat it or we've got to exclude it. We can make space, but it might be tricky for us at the same time.
Yep, totally. And so, Cathy, I think we've got a tricky question here. And so, is it a myth that insulin is a growth hormone? And is it inevitable that someone will gain weight from using insulin?
So insulin is a growth hormone. It's what they call an anabolic hormone. It's one of these hormones in our body that kind of gets us to store as opposed to kind of burn things. I suppose it's not inevitable. I think sometimes where I see that being tricky is often people will have lost quite a bit of weight around diagnosis and then will associate the weight regain with starting insulin. But their body needed to come back into balance and equilibrium. So that's just, I suppose, that's what happens. I think the scientific evidence would suggest that if somebody starts on insulin, they may gain a small amount of weight, a couple of kilos over and above what they might have been before they needed insulin. So it's not significant, or it's not something that should I suppose be a major worry to people. I think it's always worth talking to your diabetes team if you're concerned about that. Sometimes maybe a different type of insulin may suit you better if it's a concern.
Cool. A great answer to a tricky question there. And so I guess one more question before we go to the polls again. And so this is from Julia, who's just going vegetarian. And she has no idea about counting beans, pulses, and lentils. And she's also a little worried about getting good protein without cheese, fat, and she doesn't actually like eggs. And so I guess what might be some advice around counting carbs and just determining how much insulin to take when moving and transitioning to a vegetarian or maybe vegan style diet? Beth, maybe?
Yeah, so I think what's important to think about when you're sort of shifting to a more vegetarian-based approach is that you're going to increase your fiber quite a lot. So again, it's kind of just having a watchful eye on how that might slow down absorption of carbohydrates in terms of the fiber you can't digest. It just bogs out stool and keeps your digestive system really happy, but it can impact the release of the sort of carbohydrate into sugar. When it comes to carb counting for things like beans, I would probably suggest really relying on one of the apps, like the Carbs and Cows app Cathy mentioned, just because it has all the plates on there and you can have a good little look. If you want to just weigh things out to get yourself going and make a little log that you could keep, I'd encourage that. But I also think weighing out every single meal might be a challenge. So you might just want to kind of sort of weigh a couple of times and then you can eyeball it for the rest. And when it comes to protein, I think great shout that you're already thinking about how to get protein. And I think the key thing just to mention is that when it comes to plant-based sources of protein, you can't get all of your amino acids from like one plant. So you have to kind of mix your plants up. So just think about having, if you're going to have butter beans one evening, maybe have pinto beans the next night. So you're just mixing up the different sources of plant-based protein there. But also things like you get some nice fermented tofu, like tempeh is quite nice. Yeah, you could make some nice, I'm just thinking, getting my food brain on, but you could do a nice kind of flaxseed egg if you were sort of wanting to make some bread or do some bakery if you're not going to have eggs. So I think it's about being creative, but also not forgetting diversity, because if you're limiting other sources of food, then you want to really be sort of making the most of the plants you're eating.
Cool. Wonderful advice again. So thank you. So let's have a quick look at the polls. And so our first question was around, did you know that the numbers on food packaging is allowed to be up to 20% different from what is shown? We've got a nice mix of answers. So about 30% of you said you do know. About 43% said you'd probably never heard of that before, which is a little bit worrying because this is quite important information. And another 30% have said that they suspected it but never had proof. So hopefully we have shed a little bit of information and a little bit of light on potential what could be going on with sort of carb counting there. We've also got the question of, would you like support on experimenting with different or more complex foods? And so, yeah, overwhelmingly 75% of you say yes, you'd love to eat more on different foods. And so, as we've heard from both Beth and Cathy, there is that restriction period that people sort of tend to go through with diabetes, and trying to expand out into different foods does also seem to be a challenge because, again, we have some people who are worrying about managing their blood sugar and they might feel it's too challenging. And some people have, as they've also answered, no, they're quite happy with their diet at the moment. And so that's great to hear as well. And I guess finally, we've got the, where do you primarily go for diabetes tips and information? And again, we've got a great split here. So a third of people go to their healthcare professionals, which obviously are a wonderful source of information. We've got 27% looking on social media and another 20% looking at websites and blogs. 10% also go to diabetes forums, and we know the diabetes community is strong and often very helpful. So that's a great source. And some people are also checking out the diabetes charities, books, and also getting information from their friends and family. So it's really interesting to hear like your different thoughts and ideas and what's going on in your lives as well, because that helps to also sort of give some clarity around both what we're hearing from Beth and Cathy, but also some of the questions that are coming in. And it really backs up a lot of the research that we're doing at Quinn as well. We hear so many of the same and similar answers from people. So it really does help us with this. But let's go back to do a few more questions because they've now been pouring in. So Cathy, what are your thoughts on insulin shaming?
Ooh, so I guess that's where I think probably what the person means is where if you're using bigger dose of insulin or adjusting your insulin more freely, that's seen as a negative thing.
I'll be honest, I don't know.
Right. Okay. I'm if I'm incorrect, whoever asked the question can type in another question.
Yes.
So I suppose Yeah, and that's quite a common thing, I suppose, that we'll come across, or a high level of concern about the amount of insulin people might be taking. There was another question there about maximum dose. I think the way we always think about it in Daphne's sense is your pancreas would be making that amount of insulin if it was functioning. So you need the insulin that you need for your body's metabolic needs and the amount of carbohydrate that you're eating. So really encourage people, not to be concerned about the dosing. And again, probably something to talk to your diabetes team about. I think that's a helpful way that I'd always think about it. The pancreas would make this amount if it was working, and it's just not working. So unfortunately, I have to make that decision instead.
Cool. Another great answer. And again, somewhere where I need to be educated a bit more about people living with diabetes too.
And can I just add to that as well, Barry? Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to say, I think sometimes what can happen as well is that people have a very clear and fixed idea of how much they should have. And it may have been a certain amount they had previously, or kind of, when they were younger or something. And I think often I see people wanting to get back to X amount of insulin per day. And again, I think it's some gentle questioning around why that might be. And I think Cathy's suggestion of saying, well, actually, your pancreas would be doing this anyway. This sort of fixed number we've got our eyes set on can sometimes be a distraction from the fact that actually it doesn't really matter how much you're taking. If you need it, you need it. And I think perhaps it taps a little bit into the idea that sometimes we might think insulin causes weight gain. So people want to try and sort of minimize insulin to be able to manage weight. So I think it's quite a sort of complex picture, or at least in my experience it can be. So I just wanted to add that in quickly.
Cool. No, wonderful. Again, I think go on. Sorry,
sometimes I was going to say the language that we use as healthcare professionals, we'll talk about things being normal or not normal, and it can be just something that's inadvertently said in a conversation. Oh, that's an amount of insulin, or that's a unusually large amount of insulin, and that can really sit with the person thinking, gosh, am I really different to everyone else? So there's something in that as well for me, I think, as healthcare professionals, our language and being sensitive to that and conscious of the words that we use when we're describing things like insulin doses.
Yeah. Again, great points. And actually, I'm going to bring up a question here that we've unfortunately heard quite a lot about, and it's how do you deal with the bad days? And someone, Olivia here, is especially struggling in lockdown. So maybe to you, Beth, first of all.
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, just sending a big like solidarity sort of virtual through this platform hug, because it is tough. And I think, in lockdown, there's nothing to punctuate a sort of bad day with type 1 diabetes. You're kind of just stuck with your numbers. And I think, I often say to my clients that even though type 1 is classified as a physical health condition, I would say it's 50-50 emotional versus physical, just because, yes, I think we can probably agree that counting carbohydrates might not be someone's number one sort of activity, but that probably isn't what's going to grind you down over time. It's probably just going to be the sort of mental toll of life with the uncertainty, and life with the kind of the long vision lens of the future and what that might look like. I'd say, if you're having a bad day, and this is purely personal experience as a patient, I just have to kind of give into it sometimes. And I think often I'm trying to fight against it. And what I really need to do is just say, do you know what? I'm going to put a blanket around my shoulders and sit down for 20 minutes, read a book, and just do what I need to do. And hopefully that can fit in if you're working from home, maybe in lockdown, or you've got a bit more time in the evenings, just to really kind of do some self-soothing. And I think people with type 1, we want to be the superheroes, and we want to be able to do everything despite living with type 1. But like I said before, it really is an extra job that we have to do day in, day out, and we haven't even got, one day off. So I think bearing that in mind can be really important when it comes to just one kind of rough day in the sort of spectrum of a lifetime of type 1. Is probably going to happen to us, and we've got to do what we can to be able to look after ourselves. And if that's just a bath, a pizza, if you get your insulin and carb ratios and you're happy with those, whatever it might be, I think that's really important.
Cool. And we're going a little long, but there's one last question I think we'll fit in. And so, Cathy, someone's just been diagnosed and they're struggling with snacks, and they've always been a snacker. So any suggestions for some guilt-free snacks?
So I don't think you should feel guilty about snacking, and no matter what type of food you're eating would be my first thought there. I think often when people are diagnosed, first of all, particularly, I'm not sure how it is in the UK, but in Ireland, if somebody starts on multi-dose insulin, we'll often start that concept of just having insulin with the meals, but not necessarily with snacks. And I always think it's important, if you're a snacker, to talk to your diabetes team about that, because you may need insulin with all of those snacks. I suppose some people don't necessarily want have to bolus with snacks, so sometimes having a list of maybe carb-free snacks that you can go to easily as an option if you just don't want to think about it. So things like, I suppose, nuts would be very low GI, or cheese, or those kind of snacks. But I suppose, again, come back to the concept of eating the way you'd like to eat. If you're a snacker, you're a snacker. And I suppose it's about figuring out how you get your insulin to work best for you in that setting.
Cool. That's another wonderful answer to finish with as well. And so apologies to those of you whose questions we didn't get around to answer. We will try and maybe reach out to you afterwards. And I think it's time probably for the prize draw. And so I'm going to run a quick script, and we're going to go with, it's Jess Leatham. So congratulations to Jess Leatham. We will email you after the event and get you in contact with Beth. So congratulations to you. But yeah, now that we're running over a little bit, Cathy, do you have maybe any final thoughts on what we've covered today?
So I suppose my final thought I'd like to leave people with is, and it's reflecting back on something Beth said earlier, that I think managing food with type 1 diabetes is this balance between minding your physical health and minding your mental health. And nobody can tell you where that line lies, and I think the line will change over time. So being able to be flexible with how you approach that is the key for me, and hopefully being able to work with your diabetes team to support you along that journey.
Cool, thank you. And maybe Beth, do you have any maybe final advice for those watching?
Yeah, well, just thanks for joining and for being here. I think really this is an ongoing conversation, because I think, you know, life with type 1 is ongoing, but also your relationship with food is going to kind of change and adapt over time. So I think just some final thoughts really is that if there's a way that you can sort of simplify your relationship with food, however that might look for you, and just give yourself a bit of space with food, I would really encourage that, because I think you probably have encountered different situations of maybe some tricky times with food in the past. And I think moving towards more of a kind of food freedom picture would be what we can all sort of strive for and hope to have. But it is a bit of a journey, I think. So yeah, all about the self-compassion as you go. And really glad you could all join us.
Yeah, wonderful. So thank you both again. You can find more out about Beth's services at bethedwardsnutrition.com or at Beth Edwards Nutrition on Instagram. And Cathy can be found on Twitter at CathyBreen24, advocating for people with diabetes and fighting that good fight. And so can we have some appreciation in chat for Beth and Cathy for sharing their time with us. And they've been amazing whilst doing so. And again, from me, thank you both so much for joining us. If you want to find out more about Quinn or share your thoughts on today's session, share with @QuinnDiabetes app on Instagram and Twitter. Go to quintech.io for more details about Quinn and the app. And you can download Quinn from the Apple App Store. It's available now, so search for Quinn Diabetes Management. There was a question around Android, and so we're only a small team, unfortunately, at the moment, but we will be developing an Android version as soon as we can afford to. It's very much at the top of things we want to do. So we designed Quinn for you, so if you do have any thoughts or ideas on what we can improve, please do let us know. We've worked with over 300 people in designing Quinn so far, and we would love to get that number even higher. But I guess finally, we'll be holding another webinar soon, so keep an eye out on our socials for details of that, and we'll try to get some experts as great as Beth and Cathy have been. So thank you all for watching. Enjoy the rest of your evenings, and download Quinn. Cool. Goodbye.
Thanks, Barry.
Thanks, Barry. Thanks, everyone.